Hi my friends, let's talk about Rook Endgame principles. There are few super important endgame principles that we should always remember. I will mention those ones and here we will see an example of one of them, or a couple of them actually. Well, number one, we always want our rook to be in the most possible active position in the Rook Endgames. Actually, Borevsky, one of the most famous chess trainers ever, said that the rook activity was the single most important concept to consider when playing rook endgames. And here, for example, white rook is pretty active in the 7th rank of the enemy, cutting the enemy king, and meanwhile, black's rook, even if it has for one reason a good position, is obviously less active than the white's rook. Number two, king's activity. Of course, we want our kings to be active in the endgame, and in this case, it's easy to see that white's king is way more active than black's king. Number three, the rook should be behind the passed pawn. Remember, a passed pawn is a pawn like this one that has no pawns, enemy pawns that could stop him on the way to the 8th rank. Okay, so usually I would say this is a great situation for this pawn with the rook behind it, supporting it, but in this case, because of the kings and rook's activity that the white has, is not going to be enough to save black. Yeah, black is material here, but actually, spoilers, he is losing the game. By the way, speaking about the rook behind the pawn, white's ideal position for the rook will be usually, in these kind of situations, with the rook behind the enemy pawn, if possible. Obviously not here, because black will just take it, and also white has a stronger idea here. And last but not least, the rook is a long distance piece. So we want the rook to be as far as possible from the target that the rook is going to attack, especially if that target is the king, the enemy king, so he cannot counterattack our rook. Rooks, same as bishops and queens, are usually happier when they attack from distance, but especially for the rook, this is pretty evident, I think. Now, here, as I mentioned before, because white's really active position, even if black has a pawn up, actually white is winning the game. How is so? Well, white here can play king e5. And now black has to make a move. And actually he doesn't have a good move. He cannot move the rook further right, because then white will give a check and will pick the rook. Okay? So that's an option that black doesn't have. Wow, I have many lines here that now I want to delete. It's okay. Number two, well, what about coming and giving a check? Well, then the king will come to d6. And black is going to get checkmated or lose the rook. My threat is rook a8 checkmate. And if black tries to stop it with king c8, well, I will pick the rook. Again, the difference that makes an active rook against a passive one. So what else to do? Well, push the pawn forward. Then we can come forward with the king, and we threaten once again to give the check and pick the rook. Look how, because the white's king activity, black rook has no squares on the f line, and as I mentioned before, if he goes to the right, let's say rook g8, well, I will just come and pick the rook. And finally, if he gives me check, well, I will come to d6, I threaten checkmate. The only apparently logical move to stop it is to go with the king to the left, so I have b7 as an escape square, but then check comes, the king moves, and then the rook is gone. And it will be a super easy victory for white. So I think that's it. Those are the principles that we should remember in the rook's endgame. Number one, rook's activity. Number two, king's activity. Number three, rook behind the passed pawns if possible. And finally, Oh, the rook is a long distance piece. So we want the rook to be as far as possible from the target that it's attacking, okay? And we'll see more videos in the future to reinforce these concepts, but for now I hope this one helps you to at least learn those super basic ideas that we always need to use in the Rook Endgames. Okay, that's all for now. Bye bye.